I've never really talked about this before, but something happened to me when I was 8 that still gives me chills whenever I think about it. My older brother Jake had gotten into a pretty bad car accident that evening. Nothing life-threatening, thank God, but enough that my parents had to rush to the hospital immediately. I remember my mom was crying and my dad was trying to stay calm while grabbing his keys. They told me they'd be back as soon as possible, maybe a few hours at most. Looking back, I know they were just panicked parents doing what they had to do, but leaving an 8-year-old alone for that long wasn't exactly the best decision. The house felt different the moment their car pulled out of the driveway. You know that feeling when you're suddenly aware of every little sound? The refrigerator humming, the old floorboards settling, even the ticking of the clock in the hallway seemed louder than usual. I tried watching TV to distract myself, but I kept turning the volume down because I had this weird feeling I needed to listen for something. It started maybe an hour after they left. I was sitting on the couch in our living room, still in my school clothes, when I heard what sounded like footsteps upstairs. Not the creaking sounds our old house usually made, but actual footsteps, slow and deliberate. At first, I convinced myself it was just the house settling or maybe our cat Whiskers, even though I was pretty sure he was outside. But the sounds kept happening, and they had a rhythm to them, like someone was walking around up there. My heart started beating faster, and I muted the TV completely. The footsteps seemed to move from my parents' bedroom toward the hallway. Then they stopped. I sat there frozen, holding my breath, waiting to hear something else. The silence was almost worse than the noise. I remember thinking, maybe I was just being a scared kid, you know? But then I heard what sounded like a door closing upstairs, and I knew for sure that wasn't normal. Our house didn't have doors that closed by themselves, and there was no wind inside to move them. The logical part of my brain kept trying to convince me it was nothing, but my gut was screaming that something was wrong. I decided to go upstairs and check, which sounds stupid now, but I was 8 and thought maybe if I could prove to myself it was just house noises, I'd feel better. I grabbed the baseball bat my dad kept by the front door. It was way too big for me, but it made me feel a little braver. Each step up those stairs felt like it took forever. Our stairs were old and creaky, and I was trying so hard to be quiet that I was barely putting any weight on each step. When I got to the top, everything looked normal. All the doors were exactly how they'd been when my parents left. I checked my parents' room first, then Jake's room, then the bathroom. Nothing. I even looked under beds and in closets, feeling pretty foolish but needing to be thorough. By the time I was done searching, I was starting to feel a little embarrassed about how scared I'd gotten. Maybe it really was just the house making noise. I went back downstairs feeling somewhat relieved, but that relief didn't last long. I was walking toward the kitchen to get a glass of water when I saw something that made my blood run cold. There was a shadow moving across the kitchen wall. Not mine, because I was still in the hallway. It was tall, way taller than me, and it moved slowly from one side of the kitchen to the other. I pressed myself against the hallway wall and tried to peek around the corner without being seen. The kitchen was mostly dark, except for the light from the street lamp outside coming through the window. I couldn't see anyone, but I definitely saw that shadow move. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely hold onto the baseball bat. I wanted to run, but run where? The front door was past the kitchen, and I had no idea if whoever was in there would see me. My 8-year-old brain was trying to process what was happening, but it felt like my thoughts were moving through mud. All I knew was that someone was definitely in my house, and I was completely alone. I stood there in that hallway for what felt like hours, but was probably only a few minutes trying to figure out what to do. The shadow had stopped moving, and I couldn't hear any sounds coming from the kitchen. Part of me wondered if I should just run upstairs and hide in my room until my parents came home, but I was terrified of turning my back on whatever was in there. Then I heard it. the sound of our refrigerator door opening. That distinctive suction sound it made followed by the light clicking on. I could see the glow spilling into the hallway where I was hiding. My stomach dropped because I knew, absolutely knew, that there was someone in my kitchen going through our fridge like they owned the place. I remember thinking how weird it was that someone would break into a house just to get food, but then I realized maybe they were planning to stay for a while. The thought made me feel sick. I heard some rustling around, like they were moving things, and then the fridge door closed again. That's when I made probably the dumbest decision of my life. I decided to try to get a look at whoever it was. I crept closer to the kitchen entrance, staying low and moving as quietly as I could. When I peeked around the corner, I saw him. It was definitely a man, tall and skinny, wearing dark clothes. He had his back to me and was standing at our kitchen counter, and it looked like he was eating something. Just standing there in our kitchen, in the dark, eating our food like it was the most normal thing in the world. I couldn't see his face, but something about the way he was standing there so casually made it even more terrifying. This wasn't some desperate person who had broken in and was panicking. He seemed comfortable, like he had all the time in the world. I backed away as quietly as I could, my heart pounding so loud I was sure he'd hear it. I made it back to the living room and grabbed the cordless phone, but my hands were shaking so bad I kept hitting the wrong numbers. I finally managed to dial 911, but when the operator answered, I realized I didn't know what to say. I whispered that someone was in my house, and she kept asking me questions I couldn't answer properly because I was so scared. She wanted to know if my parents were home, if the doors were locked, if I could see the person. I told her my parents were at the hospital and that there was a man in my kitchen, but she kept asking me to speak louder, and I was terrified he'd hear me. The whole conversation probably lasted less than 2 minutes, but it felt like forever. She told me to find a safe place to hide and that officers were on their way. I hung up and looked around our living room, trying to figure out where to go. Our house was small, and there weren't many good hiding spots downstairs. I could hear movement in the kitchen again, and it sounded like he was opening cabinets now. The idea of him going through all our stuff made me feel violated in a way. I couldn't really understand at 8 years old. I decided to hide behind our big armchair in the corner of the living room. It wasn't a great hiding spot, but it gave me a view of both the kitchen entrance and the front door. I crouched down there with the baseball bat, trying to make myself as small as possible. That's when I heard his footsteps again. But this time, they were coming toward the living room. I held my breath and pressed myself against the back of the chair. I could hear him walking around our living room, and at one point, his footsteps stopped right in front of where I was hiding. I was sure he'd found me. I closed my eyes tight and gripped the bat, even though I knew there was no way I could actually use it against a grown man. But then his footsteps moved away, toward the stairs. I heard him going up, those same slow, deliberate steps I'd heard earlier. Part of me was relieved he was moving away from me, but another part was terrified about what he might be doing up there. Was he going through my parents' room, my brother's stuff? The thought of this stranger touching our personal things made me feel sick and angry at the same time. The police sirens seemed to take forever to get to our house, but when I finally heard them, I felt this huge wave of relief wash over me. I could hear the footsteps upstairs stop suddenly, and then there was this eerie silence. I stayed crouched, behind that chair, not moving, until I heard the officers banging on our front door and shouting, "Police!" That's when I finally came out of my hiding spot and ran to let them in. There were 2 officers, and they immediately started asking me questions while one of them went to search the house. I was talking so fast and probably not making much sense, but they seemed to understand that someone had been inside. The officer who stayed with me kept asking if I was hurt and trying to calm me down. I remember feeling embarrassed that I was crying, but I couldn't stop. When the other officer came back downstairs, he told his partner that whoever had been there was gone, but there were definitely signs someone had been in the house. He said they'd found wet footprints in the upstairs bathroom and that a window up there was open. The officers called my parents, and I could hear my mom screaming on the phone when they told her what happened. They got to the house maybe 20 minutes later, and my mom just grabbed me and wouldn't let go. My dad was furious, not at me, but at the whole situation. That's when we found out the worst part. In all the chaos of rushing to the hospital, for my brother, they'd forgotten to lock the front door. It wasn't even closed all the way. The officer explained that this was probably an opportunistic break-in. Someone had noticed the door was open and decided to help themselves to our house. But what bothered me most was how comfortable that guy had seemed. He wasn't rushing around, grabbing valuable stuff like you'd expect from a burglar. He was just hanging out in our house like he lived there. The officer said that sometimes people do that, find empty houses and just make themselves at home for a while. The thought that he might have been planning to stay longer if I hadn't called the police still gives me chills. What really messed with my head was finding out what he'd actually done while he was there. My parents went through the house with the officers, and it was worse than I'd thought. He'd made himself a sandwich in our kitchen using our lunch meat and bread, and he'd left the plate right there on the counter like he was planning to come back for it. He'd used our bathroom upstairs, and my mom found that he'd even taken a shower. There were wet towels on the floor and everything. The window the officer mentioned was in my parents' bedroom, and it looked like that's how he'd gotten out when he heard the sirens. But here's the part that still bothers me the most. He'd been in my room. My mom noticed that some of my toys had been moved around, and there were indentations on my bed, like someone had been sitting there. The thought that this stranger had been in my personal space, maybe even lying on my bed while I was downstairs, made me feel sick. I couldn't sleep in that room for weeks afterward. The police dusted for fingerprints and took a report, but they were pretty honest that they probably wouldn't catch the guy. They said this kind of thing happened more often than people realized. Someone sees an opportunity with an unlocked door or open window and just walks in to see what they can find. But this felt different. This wasn't someone grabbing our TV and running. This person had made himself comfortable in our home. He'd eaten our food, used our shower, sat on my bed. It felt personal, like he'd invaded not just our house but our lives. The officer told my parents that we were lucky nothing worse had happened, that most of these situations don't involve any confrontation. But I kept thinking about that moment when his footsteps had stopped right in front of my hiding spot. Had he known I was there? Was he just playing with me? I'll never know, but that uncertainty has stayed with me all these years. The weirdest part about the whole thing was how normal everything went back to being after that night. My brother came home from the hospital a few days later with just some stitches and a broken arm, and life pretty much returned to normal. My parents installed new locks and a security system, and we never left doors unlocked again. But for me, something had fundamentally changed. I became hyper-aware of every sound in our house, especially when I was alone. Even now, as an adult, I check and double-check that my doors are locked before going to bed. What bothers me most is that we never found out who it was or why he chose our house that night. The police never caught him, and there were no other similar break-ins in our neighborhood after that. It was like he just appeared in our lives for those few terrifying hours and then vanished completely. Sometimes I wonder if he'd been watching our house, waiting for the right opportunity. Or maybe it really was just random chance that he noticed our unlocked door that night. I've thought about this incident countless times over the years, and there are still details that don't make sense to me. Why did he seem so comfortable staying for so long? Most burglars want to get in and out quickly, but this guy acted like he had all the time in the world. And why did he go into my room? There was nothing valuable in there, just toys and clothes. The fact that he sat on my bed still creeps me out more than anything else. I've never shared this story with many people because it sounds almost too bizarre to be true. An intruder who breaks in just to eat a sandwich, take a shower, and hang out in a kid's bedroom. but it happened, and I lived through every terrifying minute of it. The experience taught me that sometimes the scariest things in life are the ones that don't have clear explanations. That man walked into our house, made himself at home, and then disappeared into the night like he was never there at all. I have no idea who he was, what he wanted, or why he left without taking anything. And honestly, that's what scares me the most about the whole thing, the complete randomness of it all.